Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In this, our first Talking Transformation podcast episode of 2020 and the new decade, we take a journey down under to Australia. We catch up with two professionals who've exported their talents, their thinking, to the cities of Sydney and Melbourne respectively. The loss of professional South African talent to the international market has become a major capacity constraint for both the public and private sector in recent years. It's not just the talent, but the experience that's being eroded, and whilst this will always provide opportunities for a next generation of South African built environment professionals, the loss of creativity and committed professionals is a significant challenge for South Africa. I've always been interested to understand the perspectives and the challenges faced by colleagues, professionals who have chosen new challenges in foreign lands, and in the last month I had the opportunity to speak to two former colleagues and friends on a recent visit to Australia. Tony Marks, who you'll hear from first, and Marco Geretto have proven track records of excellence here in South Africa, supporting dynamic development processes and initiatives. They've both served within public and private sectors, and have contributed directly and indirectly to spatial targeting initiatives such as the integration zones, land packaging of public land, particularly in Tony's case, and informal settlement upgrading guidelines, and numerous urban design initiatives in Marco's case. Marco was also one of the driving forces of the Open Streets initiative here in Cape Town, an initiative which continues to challenge the status quo, car-based design and use of space in our cities. It was a pleasure to serve alongside these colleagues, and they were gracious enough to spend time with me reflecting on their recent adventures and observations. I wanted to understand what were their challenges, what were the things that resonated and carried over from South Africa, and what was different. What was keeping them up at night? What was keeping them busy? What in their new cities of choice were the big choices that the administrations or the companies that they were working for having to make? We'll hear from both in turn, talking about issues such as public transportation or transportation infrastructure more generally, property markets with extortionately high costs associated with them, driving rapid city building and economic growth, the influence of international money and the unintentional consequences of those investment patterns. We'll also reflect on some of the societal challenges, issues of homelessness, drug dependencies, and one of the big ticket items clearly when we were there over that Christmas and festive period was the whole issue of climate change, most directly illustrated in the ravaging fires that were decimating much of the bushland there in Australia. What was interesting to me was how similar some of the challenges are between the two contexts of South Africa and Australia, between cities that are emerging from a fast economy off a fast base. Obviously here in South Africa still struggling with growth rates of 1% or so, but so many of the issues are the same. How they're being tackled, with what investment, with what resources, and with what choices are being made, I think makes for the interesting conversation. Our conversation starts with Tony Marks in Melbourne, talking about his immediate experiences over the last 2.5 years since he arrived in the country, and specifically his experiences working within the equivalent of the provincial department that's charged with looking at forward planning, strategic planning of greenfield sites there in Melbourne. As always, we hope you enjoyed the episode and would welcome your feedback via the Twitter platform, or alternatively using the voice message app on the Anchor podcast platform. So I'm here with Tony Marks. It's a Sunday morning and we're in one of the neighbourhoods in Melbourne. Tony, it's fantastic to be here with you. And really today what I wanted to do is to talk to you about your experience here in Melbourne as a town planner, working in a new environment, a new country, a city with its own challenges. Let's start with where are we situated today? What's the characteristics of Melbourne? and let's talk a bit about this new city, which is now your new home.
Thanks, Pete. Great being with you, and it's really good seeing you. It's like a blast from the past, a very pleasant blast from the past.
Indeed.
So we're sitting in Caulfield, which is one of the sort of inner middle suburbs of Melbourne. It's quite an affluent suburb that we're sitting in. Looking at it with a planner's eyes, it's a really low density suburb, but a suburb that's starting to see quite considerable change. So one of the key features that we're seeing is real densification along some of our public transport routes. The major road that runs down near us is Balaclava Road, and what we've seen is a development of a lot of apartment blocks along that road. They're not massive apartments, so we're not talking the 30, 40 story or even 15 story. They're sort of 4 story apartment buildings. They're pretty interesting in that we normally talk about 3-4 story walk-up apartment buildings. These have got lifts, so they're a different end of the apartment market from what we're normally considering.
Understood.
And what's really interesting about them is that they've started to offer an opportunity for older folk who want to age in place, they want to stay in the area, to move out of the bigger house with all of the maintenance issues and start moving into these apartments. So that's a really interesting change. The other change that we're seeing, and probably not as much in the area where we're actually sitting, but generally within Melbourne and in some of the more leafy suburbs, is we're starting to see the development of semi-detached properties on previously freestanding single lot housing. So that's quite an interesting change, and that's a really interesting incremental form of densification.
And very much a break with convention, if I
Very
understand
much
it
a break from convention. You know, the old Aussie standard was always the sort of dream of owning your freestanding house on a quarter-acre block, and you were the master of your own domain. And we've all heard of the castle and those good old Aussie movies where we saw that Aussie dream, and that's really starting to change. And we're seeing that change being driven by two factors, I think. It's firstly people looking at it and going, I just can't be bothered to maintain that size of land and property anymore. It's just too much work, it's too expensive, it's too hard. And the other driver being that we're starting to see people coming in from other parts of the world that are far more used to a completely different way of life, and they're really comfortable with apartment living and a far more, I wouldn't say communal, but a far higher density form of living. And the other big driver, of course, is property values, and we can't not have that conversation about the cost of property in Melbourne, because I think it's one of those things that's becoming a worldwide phenomenon. This year, I saw one of the major investment banks listing the Melbourne and Canadian property markets as two of the biggest risk factors for the world economy going forward.
Fascinating, Tony. I mean, clearly property prices, the whole property dynamic, particularly in that residential sector, is such a big issue, and we'll no doubt come back into that as the conversation continues. But let's talk about Melbourne. It's always put up as one of these global cities which is very much leading in terms of livelihood indicators, in terms of quality of life, etc. Tell us about this city. You've described quite eloquently the neighbourhood. Let's talk about the city as a whole and your experience of it as a global brand leader in the built environment, or does it live up to the hype?
So, Pete, I think that's a really interesting conversation, and it's interesting because it's a conversation that's being had quite a lot amongst built environment professionals working in Melbourne. Does the city still live up to its hype? And my answer would be yes, and I think there's always an and in any kind of built environment discussion. So when you talk about Melbourne, I think you've got to talk about inner and middle Melbourne. So that's the area from the CBD radiating outwards, and those are predominantly the older, more established suburbs of Melbourne. And there is absolutely no doubt that those areas are absolute leaders when we come and talk about livability. we spent yesterday walking around the Melbourne CBD. It's a great CBD.
For sure.
And in my opinion, it ranks up there with just about any other one of the great CBDs around the world.
Some immediate observations yesterday, Tony. Excellent walkability as a pedestrian. Free tram service within the CBD, within the inner core there, that you were able to navigate by foot, by tram. Very, very well integrated systems between the train, the bus, and and those networks. A lot of cyclists out and about on their bikes. We actually saw a bike jam at one stage, which was quite amusing to see at an intersection, the cyclists waiting to move, and there was a group of 6 or 8 of them, and almost a sort of a traffic jam of cyclists. So yeah, I definitely got that feeling of you're in a very high quality urban environment, high quality of accessibility. But there were also issues as we walked around and as we drove around. The idea of, you said, Melbourne is a sprawling city. So when we talk about urban sprawl, in many respects, you've talked about the low density nature of it. It is challenged in terms of the costs and the affordability of some of the other issues like healthcare and so forth came up as big conversation points yesterday. Anything you'd like to articulate further on that?
Definitely. So I think there are a range of issues, and I think the first thing that you've got to acknowledge is that there is absolutely no environment that's perfect.
Of course.
And there are going to be chinks, holes and cracks in every area. So looking at the central business district, the CBD area that we were in yesterday and we were talking about, I agree with you completely. Fantastic networks, really great connectivity, and that really extends very well into the inner and middle areas, and there's a very well developed train and tram network, and that really lays the backbone for a great public transport network. And again, you've got a series of rivers running out, and those rivers form the backbone of a cycling and NMT or active transport corridor, and that works really well. And if you're in one of these inner and middle areas, that is really working well. I think one of the key features that we saw yesterday was an increase in homelessness.
Yeah, that was very prevalent in each of the cities that we've visited so far, Tony. Yep.
And I think if you talk to Melburnians, they'll tell you that this is something that they are very aware of and really concerned about. Because whenever you have homelessness, it's an indicator that there is real social issues at play. One of the things that we know is a big issue is dependency and drug addiction within our city, and it's a really significant issue, and it's an issue that Australia seems to have been grappling with for a very, very long time, and seems to be more of a concern and more of an issue in Australia. I remember coming here 15-20 years ago, and my family who live here having talked about real concerns around drug addiction. It's hard to say whether it's a bigger issue here than anywhere else, or where it's just a more apparent issue. So I think that's a big driver of homelessness in the city, is that it's people who are homeless because of their addictions. And there's no doubt that by and large people, there is a safety net, and people do get picked up by that safety net. However, when they're in a cycle of drug addiction and other addictions, they tend to struggle to access the services in the safety net. That said, I think there are issues within our safety net. We know we don't have enough affordable housing, we don't have enough social housing, we don't have enough state-provided housing, and that's a really big issue. And I think because for so long this has been a relatively affluent society, it's been relatively easy to deal with at a relatively small scale. As society has grown, the scale of the problems grow, because this is a rapidly growing city. That's got to be one of the defining features of Melbourne, is just the incredible rate of expansion. We're seeing the city putting 1 million people a year into the city. An additional 1 million people every 10 years into the city. So it's really growing rapidly. I believe last year, Victoria grew by about 250,000 people.
Wow, and I mean, if I understood correctly, Melbourne is just short of 5 million people, similar size to a Cape Town, if you like?
Correct. So what I was saying is that we've got a rapidly growing city. we've got a rapidly growing population, and when your population grows, proportionately all of your social issues grow with it. And I think when you move from being a relatively affluent society, relatively homogenous, and you start changing and growing, and those problems grow, you may not necessarily be best placed to deal with them.
One of the things when you worked in South Africa, which I think you became quite an expert and certainly researched a lot, analysed a lot, was in and around the social housing, that affordable housing market within South Africa, which we struggle with, we know that, but it's there, it's absolutely imperative within a South African context. How do you see yourself being able to utilise that experience, having worked with organisations such as NASHO, the National Association for Housing Organisations, to bring that into this space and say, you know what, I have experience, let us talk about the South African journey and your experience more particularly here in the Australian context?
My experience in South Africa, I think, will be absolutely fundamental here around social and affordable housing. There is an interesting dichotomy going on within Australia around the provision of affordable housing. In the 60s and 70s, there was quite an extensive affordable housing provision that was undertaken. And what's really interesting about it is that while it wasn't perfect, and no program is perfect, affordable housing was provided in areas of quite high income. So there wasn't this idea of creating enclaves of poverty, but there was an attempt to provide affordable housing and state-owned affordable housing, rental housing, in a range of locations.
In a similar way, I guess, to sort of the Dutch model that we see.
Correct. I think often the way it was provided may not have fitted in as well, and generally you can drive past and you'll say, oh, that block of flats in this location is clearly social housing or clearly state-provided affordable housing, and so that's something that needed to have been reworked. But increasingly, there has been very little delivery on that front. I know the Department of Health and Human Settlements, and I've got a friend who works in that environment, is re-looking what they have and trying to provide more. But I think one of the areas where the work we did in South Africa would be absolutely fundamental and useful would be around the idea of the self-sustaining model of affordable housing, where we were looking at how we can cross-subsidize the affordable housing component using an element of market provision, building a model that starts generating a long-term revenue stream. I think there's a lot of work around that. I think the work that we did with NASHO around modeling affordable housing is incredibly important, because what that allowed us to do is understand how we can engage with the development community to leverage outcomes that they wish to achieve that would allow us to demand an element of social and affordable housing. And I think that's something that's quite a big topic here at the moment, is talking about percentages of affordable housing coming into new development. And I think the conversation needs to be more nuanced, and I think the work that we did is a good example of how you can start nuancing that conversation so that when you're engaging with developers, you're not engaging around numbers that they're pulling out, but you've got a fair sense of what their costs are, what their drivers are, what it is that they're looking for and need, what it is that they can actually deliver within an affordable, that remains affordable, and then pulling that into a conversation and tweaking the system so that you get a better outcome. So I think that's really an area where the work we did in South Africa could definitely be applicable here.
Okay, so Tony, just to summarize this issue around affordability and the sort of social element of a more affordable housing, the municipalities here in Melbourne do not at this stage build, construct, manage. So when we typically talk about sort of social housing, the social housing institutions within South Africa, that's not something that is their core business at this stage. This is not something that they're doing now in 2020.
So it's an interesting structure, three spheres of government, far more federal than the South African system. So federal government in Australia is a much higher overarching body. Think of it similar to the US system.
we're talking about the bigger brother, if you like.
The bigger brother.
Okay.
That's it. State government, which would be the equivalent of provincial government in South Africa, is far more involved in setting legislation, finance, implementation, much stronger, and has a far more direct hand in operation than provincial government in South Africa.
Understood.
If that makes sense. And then you have in Melbourne, Greater Melbourne area, 31 municipalities,
Wow.
all with a very high level of autonomy. In the housing space, it's state government who provide housing, affordable housing, and then you've got a number of social and affordable housing providers who are operating on a non-profit basis.
Understood.
So your municipalities, by and large, their role is to advocate for, try and work with, try and find levers that can assist affordable housing providers, but ultimately the provision is sitting with either NGOs and probably the biggest provider is the Department of Health and Human Settlements, which is a state government at the moment.
Perfect. Now, thanks for explaining that, Tony. We're sitting here with the global media focused on Australia and specifically around the terrible and devastating fires that have taken place around much of the eastern board of Australia. It's brought into sharp focus both in terms of the political as well as the media attention, the whole question of climate change. This is an issue which is permeating throughout all of sort of one of the probably the most contemporary issue we're dealing with right now in planning terms. What, if anything, has been the response has been within your workplace, your observations about this issue with Melbourne being on that eastern side of the country? What is your take on it?
There's been a real concern for a long time here about climate change. Obviously, from a political perspective, you've got a difference in perspectives around climate change between federal government and state government here. And I think that's an interesting and a useful dichotomy to understand. From a state government perspective, there's been a real understanding that however things proceed, we're likely to see far more extreme weather events. And Australia being a particularly hot and dry country, we're likely to see that resulting in fire, heat, and drought. We're a city that has a massive amount of coastline literally being built around, around a bay. So on the one side, you've got forest and grassland. On the other side, you've got a bay which can be affected by sea level rise and storm surge. So there's a lot of thinking that's been going on around it. I think one of the biggest things that Melbourne has been doing over the last number of years is looking at the idea of the 20-minute walking city. So in the green field areas where I've been working predominantly, a huge focus is on delivering 20-minute neighborhoods. And that's a neighborhood where people are able to access all of the goods and services and daily requirements that they need, community facilities, schools, sports areas, retail, and hopefully some employment within a 20-minute walk of where they live. And that's been a big factor in saying, how do we drop our dependency on cars and obviously our emissions? And then there's a big focus on how we cool and green. And it's about building an urban canopy to try and reduce the amount of heat that's coming in, how we think intelligently about utilizing our water resources, because the irony of urban development is, although we're in a water-stressed region, one of the things we land up with is large amounts of runoff that need to be managed. They put a huge amount of strain into our urban waterways when we put those flows from a hardened catchment in. So there's been a lot of thought going in about how we actually use that water that's moving through our areas and use it to cool and improve the greening. And there's a lot of thought going on about integrated water management. I would go so far as to say that we're now at a point where we actually need to see some concrete direction in our integrated water management policy. And I think there's a lot of theory sitting in it, but it needs to be translated into direct policy. The 20-minute neighborhood work, though, is very concrete, and it's very apparent in the greenfields areas where there's a lot of work being done. I'd say Melbourne's probably one of the world leaders in greenfield development. there is no doubt that the quality of our greenfields areas is superb. But, and there's always a but in it, one of the big risks or issues with greenfield development is that it often takes a long time for infrastructure to catch up. And Melbourne may be one of those cities that's actually a victim of its own planning success. In so many other areas, we've seen leapfrog development that's effectively forced the development of a new node because there is nothing else to service an area. Melbourne has actually developed relatively consecutively, and the result has been that we tend to look back to the city centre, which, interestingly, like Cape Town, sits eccentric from the rest of the city because of the geography of the band where it was originally developed. And we tend to look back to that, and again, the really good transport linkages that have existed have allowed a heavy reliance on the CBD.
Understood.
And one of the things that hasn't really formed in the city is a series of really strong nodes.
Secondary nodes, sub-metropolitan, whatever you want to call them, yeah?
Correct. So there are other nodes, but they haven't formed to the same extent that a Century City or a Belleville,
in Joburg, yeah.
That it just hasn't developed to that point where we're seeing significant tower development for office blocks and those kinds of things.
And boy, we saw some, just again, going back to our walk around the CBD yesterday, there were cranes and massive skyscrapers either being redeveloped, reclad, or brand new ones coming into their place.
Absolutely. And what we're seeing is a huge amount of commercial investment going into the CBD. Your other commercial nodes around the city are by and large picking up a bit of office function. They're primarily, though, service industrial nodes, and we're not seeing that really big employment creation in our outer areas. And again, I think that's going to change. One of the really big things that's going to come through Melbourne in the next few years is the outer suburban rail loop, and that was announced at the last elections.
So it's a big game changer.
It's
right?
a big game changer because effectively what it's going to do is it's going to put a rail connection in the middle suburbs, the radial rail network. There's not a lot of detail that's coming out at the moment, but what we do know is there's a lot of thinking around the precincts that are going to be created at those junction points. And I think this could be the single biggest shaping exercise in Melbourne after the original Hoddle grid was laid down. But going back to climate change, Pete, it's really interesting. We started off the discussion talking about a low-density city. And there's no doubt that a low-density city is never going to be great from a climate change perspective. And there's a real push in Plan Melbourne to say, we've got an urban edge. We're actually going to hold it really hard. It's an urban growth boundary. And at all levels in government at the moment, there is a commitment to saying this is the growth boundary. We have got a significant amount of supply within the greenfields areas, but we're expecting a large proportion of the growth that the city is going to experience. And it's being planned for that the city is going to continue growing at a rapid rate to be accommodated within the existing urban development in inner and middle Melbourne. And so there's a real push towards densification, and there's a real tension that you and I chatted about yesterday in the first part of our discussion, where we were saying clear state government direction, everybody in the policy and development realm buys the need for it, but councils, municipalities are really struggling with how they deal with that with their constituents who vote for them.
Understood.
And certain areas, it's happened, there's been pushback, but it's happening. And the conversation we were having a few minutes ago, talking about how some of the major streets are accommodating that 3-4 story apartment development, I think is a prime example of how the market is driving it, and councils are facilitating it. They're struggling with it, but they're facilitating it.
One of the things that we saw here towards St Kilda in particular were certain streets seem to have gone through quite a change and a challenge in respect of its tenancy of what I would call the traditional high street shopping or commercial centres. Brings a whole series of questions around, I guess, changing property dynamics, more market trends, but also the question of urban management. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the concept of urban management within Australia, within Melbourne particularly, and how that can either has worked or has not yet been considered within your experience here in Melbourne.
Before I touch on urban management, let's talk briefly about the property market and where things are going. We've talked about real population growth happening here, and there's no doubt that that population growth has been a driver for property prices. There have also been a number of financial policy decisions that have been made to try and stimulate a struggling property market a number of years ago, and just a struggling economy a number of years ago, and to try and get foreign investment in. I think those financial policy decisions have now played out in such a way that this is one of the hottest property markets in the world. There is a clear disconnect in this market between yield and purchase price, and that's something that always leaves me uncomfortable. And when people talk about the Melbourne property market, they talk about it in the same breath as the Vancouver property market, the London property market, and probably those are the three property markets that they talk about. London's come off now, as we know. Vancouver, we're seeing the government doing significant things to try and manage and mitigate the massive price increases that have been happening here. I think that at an Australian policy level, I don't think that we have a clarity of thought around what we wish our residential property market to be. At the moment, we're stuck between the difficulty of having driven a strong investment market here and a lot of people having entered the residential property market in a small landlording fashion, using it as a driver of private portfolio. Interestingly, we haven't seen on the same side a strong institutional investment in the property market. And so this market's in a really complex place because on the one hand, first-time home buyers are priced out of this market. And if they're coming into the market, the average house first-time property buyer, it's really far out of the city. On the other hand, we've got so much capital and wealth tied into it that it's almost reaching that point where it's too big to fail. And I have a real anxiety that when we're seeing stagnating wage rates here, we're seeing a retail sector that's really starting to struggle in Melbourne. I think that a big driver of that is that so much of the financial energy in the city is being sucked out by high property prices and people's terror that if they don't buy, they're not going to get into the market. And then on the other side, we're seeing young people who look at it and go, I will never own property in the city. I will rent for the rest of my life. And it's breaking down an investment mindset in that age group where they're saying, well, if I can't afford a property, well, what's the point in saving anything? And I might as well just go out and blow it. And so who cares if I'm buying a latte at $5.50 and, you know, chasing that down with a smashed Avo sandwich at another $15.
I was going to say, there's a 200 Rand meal right there.
Exactly.
A cup of coffee and a sandwich, right?
Exactly. So from a property market perspective, some really interesting stuff, and I think there's a point at which this market's going to need to, or policy is going to need to say, are we an investment property market and go the route that the Germans have gone and say, right, how do we make this a safe market for renters and we abandon the Aussie dream of owning a home? Or do we go back and say, right, we actually need to readjust this market? And it's very interesting, in the last elections, Labour was tipped to win. Labour was talking about policies that were less friendly to property investors, and we immediately saw the market come down by a good 15-20%.
So the market responded
The market
to that
responded
sort of noise.
immediately to that noise. There was a surprise win by the Liberal Party, and immediately we saw the market bounce back. So you can see that they're clear drivers. You were mentioning the retail stores, and again, I think that's a really interesting discussion about what's starting to happen in the broader Aussie economy, and particularly the Melbourne economy. There's no doubt that online shopping has had a major impact.
It seems to be very much evident here in this Melbourne. It takes it to a different level here.
Completely. Online shopping is huge, and I think that's affected retail, but I think it's affected retail predominantly in the areas of things that you don't need to touch and feel. Where where you're dealing with a commodity that's known. Melburnians are still shoppers. They love to get out, they love to walk their shopping strip, they love a cup of coffee. They're passionate about a cup of coffee. In fact, I'd say that there are two uniting religions in this city. It's AFL, Australian
Aussie rules footy, yeah?
Aussie rules footy and coffee. There's no doubt that retail is struggling. I think we've seen something else going on though in the market, and I think we've seen landlords starting to push rentals beyond where they can go. And that's really had an impact on some of the best known shopping strips. And you can see it's again that process of the market operating. We've seen push on rentals, stores saying we just can't do that anymore, coupled with a changing retail environment, possibly a little bit less cash available, and we've then seen those stores sitting vacant, significant periods of vacancy,
and almost strips of them. Almost certain streets, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 that are occupied versus vacant.
Correct.
That was very interesting.
It is, and it's quite interesting. Just down from where we're sitting, there's Chapel Street, and Chapel Street was probably Melbourne's best known shopping strip, and the section down by the city end of it went through a real decline about 2 years ago. It's starting to pick up again, and what we're clearly seeing is we're seeing that rentals are starting to come down, and it's allowing the more bohemian kind of shop to come in, and that drives your foot traffic.
And so there's a churn, there's a rebranding, a rethink of the what it's offering to the neighbourhood.
Correct. That leads on really nicely though to a discussion that you started about urban management. And Melbourne's a fascinating place when it comes to urban management, because if we look at the city of Melbourne in the 80s, it was a typical donut CBD. There was nothing going on there in the afternoons and evenings. People left as soon as they could after work, and it died. And the city of Melbourne did a huge amount of work, making it a far more friendly place, great urban management, and that's probably typified by the Melbourne laneways. And anybody who comes to Melbourne goes to the laneways, has a cup of coffee in a really dingy little laneway that's made fantastic by the shops that spill out onto
the vibrancy and the energy in those avenues yesterday was quite something.
It's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. At ground level, it's a great place to be. You look up and, well, you're just in a lane between two skyscrapers.
Like Gotham City or something.
It is. It quite literally is. And I think, just as a complete aside, I think when we start looking at the arguments that certain urbanists have made, may not necessarily hold true. I've always been a critic of the fight against skyscrapers and how we've got to have the openness. I think that when you see the impact of those laneways and how they can be used particularly well, I think another prime example of urban environments in Australia that just knock the trend completely of what we've been told works and doesn't work was Sydney. We have triple layer of rail, road and rail again going over the harbour area in a bridge, and yet we've got a great space underneath that's been landscaped and turned into a fantastic public space. Again, 2Ks behind us, we've got a rail project where we raised our railway lines to get them off ground level to allow better flow underneath it.
That cycle pedestrian flow, correct?
Yeah, well, cycle pedestrian flow along the railway line, but to be able to cross it so that it's no longer an urban barrier.
Right.
Everybody was talking about how worldwide those kinds of things have been nothing but a death trap, and you just create a slum underneath, and you're just going to have teenagers doing drugs under there,
Hasn't materialized.
And what we've got under there, because it was well managed and well landscaped and the space was thought through, is probably one of the very best linear walking and cycling routes that you're going to find, with great public facilities, they're fantastic parks, they're basketball courts. There's really good stuff going on underneath there, and you're seeing its impact in the fact that on a weekend there are just a ton of people walking and cycling there. And you're starting to see the houses that backed onto it, that previously had these really big fences and tried to insulate them from the railway line. Suddenly I'm starting to see gates popping up there because we use it and we cycle it regularly. I'm starting to see the gates popping open. Suddenly that fence is no longer as important.
What a pleasure.
And so interesting trends. And I think Melbourne teaches us a few things about urbanism from that perspective. And we saw early urban management being really important. And I'll probably tying up our whole conversation we've had today, where we're talking about changing demographics, changing socio-economic conditions, the impact of changes in our social spending. We are starting to see urban management issues coming into some of our more vibrant and previously really well utilized shopping strips, and Fitzroy Street is probably the best example. We took a tram down there yesterday, and there we're seeing and we're hearing in the local press proprietors of businesses complaining about urban management issues and how it's affecting their businesses. And I think we're going to see an increased push for better urban management in some of those areas of Melbourne, where the municipality and the city is going to have to enter into realms that they previously haven't had to enter because of changing social conditions, to provide a level of management and assistance that they haven't previously had to provide. And I think that's going to become an interesting space and realm. I think the other area that's going to be really interesting, and I don't know how this can be dealt with, is how we curate those kinds of areas. Because previously they were self-curating because we had a society where the number of chains were limited. The interest in the area as a shopping strip came from the fact that there were a multitude of small stores. Browsing was interesting because it was changing and different. If whatever you were looking for, you'd find it at a small scale. You'd have to go and look for it.
Sure.
But it was there, and there was something innovative and different. The risk for me around those high streets, and it's an international risk. I think we've seen it on the British High Street. It's probably the prime example where they've just become homogenous. And I think that's a massive risk for the high street.
So one high street in Melbourne looks the same as the London, same as in Paris, same as in Cape Town, Joburg. Loses its own identity, its own character.
Absolutely. And what I think Melbourne has going for it is that it has a populace who don't have an interest in the chain store. Melbourne is one of those interesting locations where a lot of chains have failed. People love uniqueness here, and I think if you had to try and define the spirit of Melbourne, it's an adventurous city where, as a friend of mine who's in the coffee business said to me, he sells around the country, and he said just about anywhere else, getting people to change just the coffee bean they use is really difficult. In Melbourne, the approach is, let's give it a try, let's try something new. And that's probably what sums up the city, is a desire for novelty.
That's a lovely place to start calling this conversation to a halt, Tony. I want to tell you, you're very much missed there in South Africa. We miss you very much. We miss your enthusiasm and your perspectives on these things. You've talked eloquently now already within, 18 months, 2 years you've been here, about the a huge amount of detail in what you've observed. Many thanks for sharing that with myself and with the listeners, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation, maybe via Skype next time, or next time you're coming to visit your family there in South Africa. There's always ways to continue the conversation. Many thanks for your time, for your hospitality, and all the very best for you in your professional endeavours with you and the family here in Melbourne. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thanks, Pete. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. I often think back to friends and family in Cape Town, and I miss Cape Town immensely.
All the best, Tony. Look after yourself. Good luck for 2020. On our first day together in Melbourne, Tony and I took a ride out on the public transportation, specifically the train system, from his home there in Caulfield North, heading in towards town, in towards the main central business district of Melbourne. We touched on issues of transit-orientated development. We took in the surroundings and what was going on in terms of some of the developments in and around and under the stations that we were passing through. This little insert is somewhat curtailed because of our arrival at the Central Railway Station there in Melbourne CBD. But hopefully you'll get a sense of some of the things that were going on in and around that train line and some of the opportunities that were emerging, some of the whole concepts, whether it's transit-orientated development and the like. The conversation concludes by considering some of the issues of the Melbourne 2050 plan or long-term vision for the city. And that was interesting given that Marco will pick up on the absence in Sydney, in his mind, of that longer term vision and planning horizon. So Tony, we just got on at the Balaclava
Street Station.
Which is the rail station, and that's was it east-west, north-south link into the CBD?
Oh, well, it runs from CBD to the southeast.
100%. And I mean, the rail is obviously one of the major public transportation options that's available here in Melbourne. What are some of the other options that are available to the commuters, people trying to get to work in and around the city?
So in inner and middle Melbourne, rail and tram are your primary public transport routes. As you move into the outer suburbs of Melbourne, bus is your primary transport route. So we haven't seen any significant new railway line development in a number of years. There are a few that are slated and a couple that are in planning at the moment, but our outer suburbs, our far outer suburbs, tend to not be particularly well served yet by rail.
Do they have other so trams, buses? That's
primarily buses. You move into the outer areas, and it's quite interesting that bus doesn't have the same kind of reputation as tram, although tram by and large moves through mixed traffic just as buses do.
It was interesting that we pulled up in what sort of park and ride scheme at there at Balaclava. Is that quite typical of what you'll find in around each of these stations? We've just pulled it at Prahan. Or Praharan, I should say. Is that something that you'll find here?
So there's as you move into the inner areas, there's less and less parking around the stations. Certain stations do have a fair amount of park and ride. There's a bit of tension, I think, in the system and a lack of clarity around whether we're pushing park and ride as a means of solving the transport issue, or whether we're looking at rather using public transport for the sort of last mile loop.
So when you say last mile, very good pedestrian connections, cycling, those are integral to the system?
Integral to the system, but also looking at other line haul methods, so tram and bus, to cover the non-trunk portion of the transport route.
We've seen in Cape Town over this last 4 or 5 years an explosion of things like Uber and this sort of e-hailing system.
Yeah.
Has that become quite a prevalent thing, and is it an important thing within the makeup and the composition of the commuter or the accessibility within Melbourne?
I think there are a multitude of rideshare platforms here in the same way as Cape Town has. They are important in the transport connection and the transport network. I'm not sure how important they are, though, for the daily, regular commute. Sorry to interrupt. What we're going past now is the new metro tunnel. So this is a massive, massive rail building project that's underway. And the idea of it is that it's going to unknot all the rail lines moving through the city, because currently they all move through a loop. And it's going to provide direct connections in and out of the city to a lot of lines, and that's going to have quite a big impact on increasing the frequency of trains on a lot of our routes.
Fantastic. We've heard a lot about transit-orientated development in and around South Africa. What, if anything, is understood as transit-orientated development here in Melbourne, and more generally what you've seen in and around the country?
So I can't comment for the country generally. I know Melbourne far better. I think there are areas where we're seeing very organic TOD developing because the market is demanding it. And we're over here at South Yarra Station, and if you look out the window, you'll see that they're multi-story residential developments on either side with ground floor.
15 stories or so we're looking at right now.
That's easily 15 stories with ground floor ground floor retail happening. So you've got that's real organic TOD, and that's really being driven by demand. As you start heading further out, you're seeing less TOD, and I don't think that there is a concerted program currently, or there hasn't been, around the development of real TOD around stations. I think that's changing because there is a proposal that is probably beyond a proposal now, it's a budget commitment to develop an outer suburban rail loop, and a core component of that is going to be consideration of how those stations that hit the crossing points of the major lines out are going to be developed and what the precincts look like. So I think that's going to be Melbourne's real push into planned TOD as opposed to market-driven TOD.
In the plans that you and your colleagues work on, what does transit orientate? Does it come into the equation, or is it called something different, or is it just about mixed use? What's the terminology that you typically be hearing about?
So it's not terminology that we work with extensively. Melbourne's works on the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood, and the idea being that within 20 minutes of the majority of households should be employment opportunities, retail opportunities, schools, recreation, and the idea being that we build strong neighborhoods that allow people the level of accessibility they need, and then obviously tying those into the public transport network.
So that idea of a sort of sustainable human settlement that we would talk about in South Africa, really you're talking about within a sort of a 20-minute walking distance.
Correct, it's 20-minute walking distance.
What role do the municipalities play? It was interesting when we drove in from the airport, you were describing that there are how many, 30 or more different local municipalities?
I think they're 32, but I could be wrong on that front. That's a number we'd need to check. So each municipality is responsible for issuing permits.
Building permits, planning applications,
approving subdivision plan, from approving subdivision plans all the way through to building permits. So your municipalities have a huge amount of control and power within the system. Effectively, they can prevent development from occurring if it requires any kind of permit, and obviously if they have a legal right to prevent that development from occurring.
How do they work together, Tony? Because I mean, if there's so many, I think population here is 4 million or something?
Just under 5 million. Probably cracked over 5 million now.
So, but if you've got 30 or so of these municipalities all playing in their own backyard, and we've seen that in the old version of South Africa pre-2000, pre the metros.
Correct.
How do each of these metro or municipalities work together, if at all, in synchronizing their planning, thinking, and the concepts as a coordinated body?
So I think the first step is that you do have state government who are the coordinators. There is a level of involvement from state government. State government set the planning agenda through Plan Melbourne. They then become involved through a variety of agencies in coordinating environmental, spatial planning. There's a transport agency that is responsible.
We're just going past the MCG, which for any cricket lovers is one of the great iconic stadiums in the world. Fantastic.
So state government plays a coordinating role to a point and is involved in the development of structure plans for new communities. And those new communities and those precinct structure planning areas may well overlap multiple municipalities. So there's a coordinating role there. However, when you start getting down to an operational level, and particularly in the more established suburbs, that's where municipalities are required to engage directly with each other. And I think so far, from what I've seen, there is a level of cooperation, particularly amongst the growth area municipalities where I have more experience. You see forums that have been established where they're working together. They generally tend to be engaged on the substantive issues, and where we're doing structure planning across 2 or 3 municipalities, you definitely see them working together to the point that when we go into a planning panel, they'll sometimes make joint submissions and even use the same legal counsel. So they do work together, but there are elements where they don't. And the discussion we've had previously is the system is very open to NIMBYism because it's very difficult for a council to take a bigger picture view about topics that can be politically unpalatable, like densification, new permits that don't necessarily fit with the existing urban fabric. And those are really difficult for councils to deal with because if they want to push the agenda of Plan Melbourne, which is accommodation of a large percentage of the growth with inner and middle Melbourne, they have to go against the wishes of their constituents, and that's particularly difficult for a council.
Quite a dichotomy, yeah?
It is.
You mentioned Plan Melbourne. What is the time frame around that? To be about 2040, 2050? So what is Plan Melbourne thinking
it's
about?
It's a 2050.
So we're basically looking 30 years henceforth, yeah?
Correct. And it's been updated a number of times.
That's the end of the first part of this Talking Transformation podcast, dealing with overseas perspectives, specifically from Down Under. The second part of our episode looks at Sydney and the experiences of Marco Geretto. Urban designer by trade, Marco is working currently within the private sector, and here he will reflect on some of the projects that he's either been involved with or he's observed as an interested party, as a resident of Sydney. We also talk a bit about our experiences of working our way through the city, on some bicycles the one day, as well as the public transportation systems that are available there, including waterways, including the trains, including the trams, etc., etc. He also talks a bit about some of the major catalytic infrastructure investments which are shaping the future of Sydney. And as I mentioned earlier, he also reflects on what, in his opinion, is some of the either fragmentation or the lack of a longer term planning vision for Sydney. So I think it makes for very interesting and compelling listening, and I hope you'll enjoy this second part of our episode Down Under. And before we hear from Marco, just a word from my side of thanks to him. He is the individual responsible for our Talking Transformation logo. When we first started talking about a podcast of any sort, Marco was one of the first people I approached and said that I was keen to start talking about that, and he was going to be one of the main protagonists. And sadly, with his move, that never came to fruition. But he's always been part of the spirit and the genesis of the podcast, and very much one of the driving forces behind the work that we do here at Talking Transformation. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. So it's a Friday evening, and I'm here in Sydney in the suburb of Leichhardt with my old colleague Marco Geretto. Marco, it's so nice to be here with you this evening. Hope you're keeping well.
Yeah, very well. Thank you, Pete.
Many thanks, Marco, for agreeing to have a chat with me about your experiences of this amazing city, Sydney. It certainly seems to be recognised the world over as a global city, batting in the top 10, top 20 of the big cities around the world. And I think you've been here now for 15 months, just short of 2 years?
Yeah, just short of 2 years. We arrived in July 2018.
And you were coming from, if I remember, a municipal planning background there in City of Cape Town?
Yeah, I had a varied background. After completing my urban design masters, I went and worked in London for 5 years and returned, always in the private sector, but doing work for the public sector. And then when I went back to Cape Town, worked for 2 years for a private consultancy, and then for 7 years at the City of Cape Town, where I met you and a lot of my other colleagues. So back to the private sector when I came back to Sydney.
So back to trying to understand what a billable hour is, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. So I mean, it's interesting already, you know, your experience to date has taken you around the world. You mentioned London, you've talked about Cape Town, and now here in Sydney. I mean, any immediate thoughts, just immediate comparisons between those big three centres that you've worked in?
I think every city is different, and that's what makes it exciting for us as planners, urban designers, urbanists generally. And I mean, I think I've been fortunate to live and work in world cities. There's something exciting about, you know, cities over 3-4 million. They start to generate a level of activity that's very exciting, particularly, you know, first world cities that are very well connected. You get exposure to a lot of new ideas, you know, what's at the forefront of the economic transformation of the global economy. That's always front and foremost in your mind, and that's what's driving the sort of development agenda and a lot of the political agendas that drive the development and planning agendas. So it's always very different how a global event can affect different cities differently. And I think that's the challenge as planners, urban designers, is just how you interpret that. And that's really what our role is, and our interface between the private and the public sector is where we're at. Whether you're working for the private sector or the public sector, that's where it is, that interface, and that's where it's exciting.
One of the interesting things that I've picked up in my travels here in Australia and discussions with colleagues, friends and family is this idea of the lack of sort of a single metropolitan coordinating authority. Or when I say that, I think Melbourne had 30 plus different local municipalities. Here in Sydney, it's a similar number.
Similar.
And so the state, or in South African context, the province plays quite a big role there, and then the federation or the national government playing another major role. I mean, maybe just a bit of a thought from your side around that sort of administrative background, just so that we can get an idea of how this city works from a governance point of view.
So from a governance perspective, I think what I find is at local government level, it's very, very fragmented, particularly within the metropolitan region. So as you say, Sydney's got about 36 local government areas.
It's vast.
And there was a process a couple of years ago where the Greater Sydney Commission was established, and they were trying to provide strategic coordination. But you can imagine with that many disparate views and the political, splitting up of the geography, it's quite a challenge, and I think it's a challenge for planning to get it all coordinated. And in this particular context, state government is very powerful, and that gets the backs of local government and local government planners and urban designers. They get their backup, and also a lot of funding comes through state and federal government, less so from federal government, but state is very, very strong, very powerful, very well resourced as well. So if you look at the department, DPI, they've just changed their name as well. They've gone through a restructuring process, as
sounds familiar.
most public organisations do. They're very well resourced in terms of personnel. So they've got a number of urban designers, and they're looking at urban design challenges across the whole state. And the state's big, and New South Wales is obviously the biggest economy at the moment, and I believe Victoria is coming up, but they provide strategic oversight, and they've got different instruments. So there's the government architect of New South Wales, who develops a whole lot of policy that's very useful. I found it incredibly useful. Policies like Better Placed, apartment design guidelines. There's a whole lot of statewide SEPs, state environmental planning policy, that tries to provide greater coordination, but it's really at the spatial level where things either work very well or where they fall down. And it's when you're trying to coordinate that local government feel that state government are stepping on their toes.
Interfering almost, yeah?
Exactly, yeah.
So reaching beyond that mandate of setting a policy, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
15 months in, I would be really interested to get your thoughts on what some of the built environment challenges that you've encountered here. I mean, obviously coming from Cape Town, we would think about issues of informality, about rapid urbanisation, about a flatland economy. When you left, it hasn't improved. That's the headlines.
Yeah.
I mean, so if that's the sort of the context of South Africa, and specifically the metropolitan authority you were working in South Africa, once you arrived, what were your immediate thoughts on arrival, and as that's progressed over these last 15 months, what have you seen? What are those challenges? What are some of the transformation issues which are challenging you and your colleagues in the public and the private sector?
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience, and arriving in Sydney has been quite difficult to get my head around how the spatial economy works, and how we as urban designers then interpret that into built form. Sydney is very ambitious in terms of its aspirations of where it wants to be as a global city. The way it pursues that is by setting goals and putting policies and resources towards achieving those goals. And what struck me immediately when I arrived, it was very numbers orientated. So each local council or each area was given a specific target to achieve in terms of jobs and houses. And the Greater Sydney Commission was trying to coordinate things and set these targets and creating an enabling environment really for the local authority to meet those targets. So the big challenges here really are, what I've really found, particularly for Sydney, is a lack of a cohesive vision of where we're going. So there are lots of good policy statements, a lot of good principles and objectives, but they don't paint a picture of the global. They don't paint a holistic global picture of Sydney and where it's going to, whether it's going to be a high-density Tokyo sort of scenario, or whether it's going to be a city that's developing along corridors, and what happens at the next stage. So if we are developing along metro corridors and transport corridors along transit-orientated development principles, what is the next stage? Where are we heading to? I found, less so than in South Africa, people aren't asking, what is the city we want to have? It's talking about great principles, but it's not translate. Even with all the skills and resources that we got available, we're not painting the picture of the future. Now, in one way, that works in government's favour, because you get a lot done. You paint a big picture of a highly dense city with 100-story skyscrapers and those sorts of things.
Excellent public transportation, etc.
Exactly. You might scare people. That might not be something a vision that people can buy into at this point in time. Obviously, the city's got amazing resources, the public transport, infrastructure. It's mobilizing towards that. It's building new airports, new metro systems. It's opening up land for development. It's thinking about how it manages water. Tree canopy is a big push here, because urban heat is a massive issue. I mean, when you've been here, we've had 42, 48 degree days.
It's been warm. It's properly warm.
Yeah. So how do we manage in an environment that's very susceptible to climate change, particularly water scarcity and heat? We've just had the fires. Those sorts of phenomenon, particularly for us in Sydney, are things we're going to have to deal with. How we deal with heat, how we deal with environmental change, and the other big one is affordability.
Absolutely, specifically in the property market for residential.
Yes, so I think Sydney as a global city is subject to forces that are sometimes out of its control. The global flows of capital into and out of cities, and how money from abroad, particularly Southeast Asia, is brought into Australia and into Sydney, and how it's used to drive the property economy, which means that there's a very buoyant property market, residential property market in particular. And properties are seen as a way to show wealth and build wealth. But property prices being astronomical, it's very, very difficult for young startups, young professionals to get a foothold into the market. And it's starting to ask very difficult questions of state and local government about, what is affordable housing? What is social housing? I mean, the question is, does a country as progressive and as aspirational as Australia need a social housing strategy and policy? But with affordability challenges, it certainly does, and I don't think it's quite reached that level of actually grasping what that means. Learning from other world cities, countries like Denmark, Singapore, the UK, the Netherlands, very sophisticated affordable housing policies and strategies that haven't quite met the ground here. And I think in part it's because Australian society's has huge confidence in the private sector. So it's seen as more a supply and demand sort of challenge than a social challenge.
Basic property economics 101, right?
Well, it's sort of distorted, because your property economics is based on supply and demand, and when demand is driven by external capital who aren't necessarily living, they're investing in the city, not living. And so, I mean, you picked up the number of vacancies of retail at ground level.
Very much so. Along some of those main, what we call sort of shopping streets here in around the neighbourhood that you're staying in, we saw, you almost sort of talked about it in a sort of Voortrekker Road corridor type of a vibe almost. And I mean, what we saw, major vacancies, very interesting tenancy mix along the ground, or the ground floor, where you would normally expect your predominant retail, and either vacant or very odd combinations.
So I think what happens is two things. I think you get a huge amount of, if you look at land uses across the city, a huge demand for residential floor space. And if all that residential floor space was occupied at 100%, you get a lot of economic activity at ground level. And because the residential property market is so buoyant, councils are almost forcing good urban design principles at ground floor level about active frontages and retail at ground floor, where the economy doesn't necessarily support it. Either that's because, people aren't living in the units, or because the disposable income isn't there. Because it's either
Right.
because people don't have as much disposable income because it's going towards very high rents or very high bonds that they're trying to service. The consequence of that is there's a lot of vacancy at street level and even along development corridors. And the development corridors are quite complex. I think a development corridor like Parramatta Road is equivalent to Voortrekker Road in Cape Town. But there are big challenges and of how you activate those ground floor uses. So it's got some very positive consequences in terms of there's space at ground floor for community uses, for the non-traditional high street uses like creches and judo and sport and recreational that sort of gym sort of uses at ground floor, which you wouldn't necessarily find on a high street.
I mean, I think the other way that it's played itself out when we've been walking and cycling and transporting around on public transportation has been, the predominance of the skyscraper, massive building activity, cranes pretty much dominating across the skyline from east to west. At the same time, punctuated by obvious evidence of homelessness, of people living rough. The big issue being sold on the streets by homeless people. And so you've got this, again, the contradiction of something that I guess is there in all global cities, but it seems to be becoming an increasing issue. And certainly my comparison between 8 years ago when I first came, and it seems to be becoming a bigger problem. I think you've picked up on that in terms of the question around what is the role of social housing within this space.
I think also the nature and the requirements of social housing have changed dramatically over the last 30 years as well. So previously, where social housing was provided in Sydney, it was provided to families in difficult times. And a lot of social housing was developed post-60s, 70s, 80s for families. What's happened is demographics have changed. You've got smaller households, you've got people living by themselves, and you got the sort of social and psychological challenge that every society's got in terms of mental illness, those sorts of things that drive
drug dependencies,
those sorts of things, and also while we've got a very high employment rate, if you're out of the loop, if you get buried into a particular way of being in the city, you start to detach yourself from normal society, and you see that playing itself out on the streets. And homelessness is an issue. It's an issue globally. I think Australia's done amazing things in terms of its acceptance and trying to integrate refugees and asylum seekers. It has got a huge way to go, but it's done a lot of. It's trying to assimilate a lot of people who are genuinely looking for asylum into the society, but it's quite exclusive and selective about how it goes about that.
One of the things that you pointed out on the horizon, the North Bank or South Bank, I can't quite remember my orientation. But you showed me one of the major, what I would call catalytic development sites, and you said this has got quite an interesting story. Is that something you'd be prepared to chat to us a bit about the challenges around activating at scale a project there by the waterfront?
Yeah, I mean, the project we were talking about is the Bays Precinct. In every city, you've got land that is in public ownership that is contested. It always holds a lot of good potential, and particularly the Bays Precinct is well located on the waterfront, close to the CBD.
Excellent mobility, as I remember.
It's got mobility constraints. It's surrounded by motorways and highways, and that constrains the sort of access to the site quite bluntly. But there are plans also for a metro station there. And so you've got these sort of, and it plays a vitally important role at the moment as a place where concrete and cement it's a concrete batching plant to support development within the CBD. So at the moment it's playing a strategic role, and it will continue to play that role. It's under Ports Authority because that's a strategic function, and yet it holds potential. It's because it's so well located, everyone thinks it should be developed. And so you get these contestations and this challenge within government to say what is the highest and best use?
Highest and best use, we're back to that. Yes.
Yeah. And what is the vision? Is it a high-tech hub? Is it smart city central, or is it a high-density residential environment? And are we looking at car-free? despite all its challenges in terms of access, you're going to have a metro station. You've got reasonable cycle links. We cycled over Anzac Bridge together. So, it is a 20-minute cycle into the CBD. There's potential for water taxis, there's potential for ferries, different modes of transportation. So there's a whole lot of potential there, but it's also at the confluence of a whole lot of constraints and challenges. So you've got the port, metro, RMS are putting the West Connects going through there. It's carving up the site, it's limiting development, and you're on the sea, and you're on the harbour. So you're constrained in terms of what you can develop. And when you've got that, and when you've got a pressure cooker situation where you've got so much potential in such a small amount of space, what public benefits are you delivering, and who's it accessible for? So, are there schools? Are there high schools? Are there parks? How much park? And those are the sorts of challenges that, as urban designers, are very interesting. But again, urban design work that we tend to do here is precinct-based, and what defines the boundary of the precinct is always a big question. And I think, if you're doing a patchwork of precincts, someone needs to think about how those precincts are linking together, and that I think is where the shortfall at the moment is. Although it's improving, it's certainly a lot better than other cities, but when you've got an uncoordinated patchwork of precincts, you're not getting city making. You need those big city moves, and that's where state government have been quite strong in providing those big city moves, but it's always difficult for them to operate. And those big city moves aren't always things that local communities are in favour of.
Well, maybe one of the initiatives you mentioned there, we should look at it more closely. You talked about the West Connect.
Yeah.
Can you tell the listeners a bit about that and who is driving it? Is that coming from the national, or is it more of a state intervention? It's
a state intervention, and there's been a lot of pushback from communities on that. So it's a state intervention, and what West Connect is a big tunnel.
Right.
It's a motorway. It's a highway through Sydney that's under suburbs. So Sydney's topography really plays a huge part in its layout.
It's not flat for the listeners.
Yeah. So Sydney's formed of ridges and creek lines and creek corridors and the harbour which dissect it, and so you've got topography that's very undulating. And Sydney grew incrementally away from its centre, and the big highway networks were never imposed as they are in American or in South African cities, where you've got a very clear road hierarchy
and reserves, etc.
Exactly. So what Sydney's done, and I think we're one of the most told cities in the world, is we've built a lot of underground highways, and these aren't small highways. They're 4 or 5 lanes, and they go underneath suburbs, and they need to be ventilated, so you get ventilation stacks, and those come out in local areas, pollution coming out, etc., etc. And there's a whole question of whether we should be investing, whether any global city should be investing in car-orientated infrastructure. Now, there are bigger arguments about freight and keeping freight off local roads. So there are pros and cons, but one of the big debates is these projects are incredibly complex. You're going underneath the harbour, you're going deep underneath, water, land. Sometimes you're coming very close to the surface in terms of, I think close to Leichhardt, we're getting close to 6 meters below houses.
Wow.
So you've got structural issues and challenges, and hugely expensive. And the question is, should we be investing in public transport in an equal measure? No, and let's not beat around the bush. Government is investing in
for sure. We've seen it. I mean, it's an extensive network, many options.
But I think Sydney is still a very car-orientated, car-dominated city. And until you transition into a higher density environment more broadly, it's gonna struggle.
What are the timeframes associated with this West Connect? I'm guessing a project like this, we're talking about decades, not so?
Look, there's a labyrinth of different tunnels and in different stages. I think the stage that they're building now, they're hoping to complete in 5 years' time. It's quite an extensive process, and there are. There's a raft of improvements and investments into public domain and public open space that comes along with it.
If you think back to what you've learned here in that relatively short period of time, 15 months or so, is there anything there that you can sort of say, if you had the opportunity of what you've learned here to bring back into a South African context, is there anything that sort of stands out of, this is really best practice and something we should be thinking about?
I think it's a very, very different context. You can't transport one solution to South Africa, and particularly when Sydney's got a very, very buoyant housing market where it can support very high property prices. You don't have that condition in Cape Town. But I think the way state government has actually set very firm targets in terms of delivering jobs and housing in particular areas and allocating and linking that to infrastructure funding and other funding, it's driven a lot of development out west, and it's delivered it into areas where those councils that are open to change are able to access a whole lot of infrastructure funding and planning funding and to make things happen. So it's really about outcome orientated design and planning processes. So, and it's about monitoring those and driving them and understanding what are the bottlenecks and just driving. I think that there's an acceptance that you might not always meet those targets, but in many, many cases, those targets are very, very useful for driving change. And I think if those sorts of lessons for Cape Town and South Africa were applied more generally, you could say, the challenges that we were experiencing with the SDF, how do we transform South African apartheid cities into something different? Why are we not setting stronger targets? Whether it's about affordable housing in particular areas, whether it's about social, economic integration, how do we get these things to happen? Government intervening in the market to make it happen. I mean, if you look at the city of Sydney, they're building affordable space and renting it discounted to the creative industries because they want the creative industries in the city of Sydney. That's intervening in the property market for a particular outcome. So, for example, if we wanted more development out in Khayelitsha, what could the city of Cape Town or what could province be doing in Khayelitsha, in Denel, in wherever it happens to be, to make it happen, to create a distortion in the market to create a particular outcome, and that is a huge lesson I think that could be drawn from Sydney in particular to Cape Town and South Africa. As
we draw to a conclusion then, Mark, I mean, it would be remiss of us not to talk a bit about you have mentioned climate change and the fires, and when we flew in, that layer of haze, smog of the smoke associated with the devastating fires here. I mean, as a South African, I mean, you know about fires. You've lived in Cape Town. You've seen Cape Town's Table Mountain be ravaged in previous years gone by. Maybe just the comparison between what you've seen here in and around this area of New South Wales and this eastern coastline, and your experience of it as a citizen now.
Yeah, I think Australia is blessed with amazing natural beauty, and part of that is preserved through national parks, and to a huge degree national parks and wildlife areas that are protected. It's just very clear that managing these areas is more and more difficult. I remember when I was studying, I think it was Peter Wilkinson asked the class, he said, "Do you think natural systems are still operating?" And the class was saying, yes,
Table Mountain's there.
We must respect them, but the reality is they need to be managed. Even in the Kruger National Park, we cull elephants. But when you're dealing with areas as big as in Australia and as unpopulated, Australia is massive for the small population that it has. Our ability to manage the environment is limited, and you're just recognizing that. You can see it with the fire situation. Climate change is wreaking havoc. We've had a huge drought throughout Australia, and traditional ways of managing the land by Aboriginal people are no longer in place anymore. And the extent of dry, vulnerable areas for fire is just enormous. And once there's a fire, it's a natural phenomenon. It would have happened. It doesn't happen as regularly as it does because we intervene in different ways. But the management of fire, the management of the environment more generally, and what it's going to mean going forward, the management of water. So we've got challenges with flooding at some points of the year in some particular areas, and we've got drought and fire in others. Our ability to manage that is limited because the climate is global. And Australia, unfortunately, has not got the best climate policy. And hopefully these fires are going to be a wake-up call for government and, a step up to more renewable resources and more sensitive approach to how we manage land and country.
Is that something that is being more and more talked about in those terms of these shocks and stresses and the concept of resilience? We've certainly seen it in South Africa become almost quite a buzzword, and a lot of work being done and invested in that. Is that something that you think is there or that will emerge from a policy point of view?
Look, I think we're very fortunate in Cape Town to be exposed and to get the support of the UN in terms of understanding the resilience challenges and threats of climate change and those sorts of things. I'm in the private sector here. I'm not in the field. I'm in urban design. I'm not necessarily in the field of resilience and resilience planning, environmental planning. It is something that is talked about. What can be done at the level of urban design is quite limited in terms of your toolbox.
Your toolbox and your footprint,
Yeah, your toolbox of what you can do. I mean, there's certainly a huge amount going around sustainable urban design, water-sensitive urban design, and as I said, reducing the heat island effect, how we increase the tree canopy, how we work with waterways, and a lot of these concepts are embedded in the indigenous understanding of landscape, and that's something that I'm finding that I'm starting to have to learn. And it's very humbling just to understand that there's a different way of understanding landscape that's not the conventional first world Western view. It's talking about a relationship with landscape that is quite different.
Quite spiritual and quite deep-rooted in the ethos.
Exactly, and it's about narratives and stories and living relationships. I haven't had the benefit of working directly with some of the sorts of communities that provide that sort of support and impact, but there's a depth of knowledge and understanding that it requires a different time frame, and I'm not quite sure with the sort of progressive stance and the fast-paced nature of development in Sydney and Australia. There's sort of a point of conflict between the one requiring more time and dedicated resources and the other wanting to accelerate
speed
and change and adapt, not in a negative way, but really to, we want to be a global leader, we want to address the challenges, so how do we do that? And I think that's one thing that really struck me about Australia, is that it's solution orientated. How do we overcome the barriers that are preventing us from going another step further, whereas other approaches are much more recognizing limitations to growth, limitations to speed, and appreciating the process.
What's the more organic approach?
Yeah, just more the process approach, and I suppose that's what's been highlighted for me. The big difference between planning and thinking and working in South Africa as opposed to Sydney is it's much more. There's a as difficult as it is, there's a belief in democratic processes. I haven't found Australia as democratic as I thought it would be, in terms of how the planning system works, how you think about a place, how you involve the community. I mean, these are very, very difficult things, and South Africans have grasped it, by the head.
For sure.
And I think it comes from that trauma of apartheid, from people not being able to participate, to a process with, South Africa didn't get it right at all in all instances, but there's a commitment. There's certainly a commitment to trying
track record of effort.
Yeah, particularly from the public sector. Really questioning in the early days when I was a student or a young professional, questioning what is a democratic city? How do we address these barriers and challenges that apartheid established? And it's a commitment to process. There was a recognition that no one knows every answer, but we embark on the process and we do it together. And it takes more time, and it's been frustrating how long it has been taking, but there's that commitment. And there's leadership at all sorts of levels. When you start to unpick things, I mean, the project that we were doing in Fulani, people were doing in Khayelitsha, VPU, etc., really getting to the grassroots of what is a democratic project. And it doesn't have to be major, it can be as small a thing as a creche or a tap or Mtangeni that VPU are delivering in Monwabisi Park. It can be a whole lot of different things, but it's that commitment to people and process. And that really quest for the public good is chasing development at all costs in the public interest. At least in South Africa, I found that we questioned that. To what end is density? To what end are we seeking a transport corridor or development corridor? What does a development corridor mean? That is where South Africans, in my mind, are ahead of the game.
On that note, Marco, many thanks for the reminder and the reminder of some of the work that you were involved in back in South Africa and some of the success stories or the principles. And many thanks for your reflections on your time here in Sydney. Clearly, from our side, I want to wish you all the very, very best to you and your family, to your professionals here, that you continue to make a difference here in Sydney. We miss you very much, and one day, hopefully we get a chance to meet again and talk some of these things through. All the very best, Marco. Thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.